In a previous lecture, we learned that aldosterone is the hormone that increases sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion in the distal tubule. Here we learn about the pathway that leads to aldosterone secretion. It starts in the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which I have drawn here. Let's orient ourselves. We have the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, the renal corpuscle, and the distal tubule. Let's add in our filtrate into the distal tubule, which still has quite a bit of sodium and chloride in it. Remember, the osmolarity at this point should be about 100 milliosmoles. We're going to return to the juxtaglomerular apparatus in just a few minutes, but first, let's actually draw out the pathway that occurs in the blood. It starts with the liver. The liver makes most plasma proteins, including one called angiotensinogen. Notice that it has a suffix ogen. We learned in a previous lecture that when something has a suffix ogen, it usually means it's an inactive form, and when it becomes activated, it's going to generate something. Renin is a particular enzyme that acts on angiotensinogen. When renin acts on angiotensinogen, it catalyzes a chemical reaction that changes angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. Now, interestingly enough, angiotensin I is still an inactive form. A second enzyme called ACE, ACE, which stands for angiotensin converting enzyme, is required to convert angiotensin I into the active form, which is aptly named angiotensin II. So the cascade is as follows. Angiotensinogen is an inactive plasma protein. Renin, which is an enzyme, catalyzes the conversion of angiotensinogen into angiotensin I. Then another enzyme called ACE catalyzes the conversion of angiotensin I into angiotensin II, which is active. So what does angiotensin II actually do? The first effect is that angiotensin II targets the adrenal glands and causes the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone. So therein lies our pathway, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. However, there are more effects than just that. Angiotensin II is a powerful vasoconstrictor and therefore also acts on the smooth muscle tone, particularly around arterioles, and causes them to vasoconstrict. In doing so, it helps elevate the blood pressure over the body. The third effect, which I'm not going to be asking you on the test, but if you're in a different class, you might be required to know this, is that it stimulates the pituitary gland to release vasopressin. So those are three major effects of angiotensin II. So what are the effects of secreting aldosterone or systemic vasoconstriction or secreting ADH or vasopressin? Interestingly enough, they all work in concert to help raise blood pressure. So increasing the aldosterone levels also increases the sodium and chloride reabsorption in the distal tubule. As we will learn in a subsequent lecture, that helps us increase our blood pressure. Systemic vasoconstriction also increases the blood pressure by making the blood vessels smaller. Secreting antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin helps with water reabsorption in the collecting duct. By putting more water back into your bloodstream, you increase the blood volume and therefore also increase the blood pressure. So angiotensin II has a variety of effects that all collectively aim to help increase blood pressure. Now, what controls whether or not this pathway will happen? It turns out that the linchpin in this pathway is the availability of renin. Angiotensinogen is a plasma protein that is always secreted from the liver, so therefore it's always available. But renin is not always available. Renin is secreted by the kidneys. When renin is present, this pathway moves forward. But when renin is absent, then angiotensinogen cannot be converted into angiotensin I, and therefore you cannot have angiotensin II, and therefore you do not get all of the effects that are listed here. So none of these things happen. So without renin, aldosterone is not secreted. So the follow-up question then is, what determines whether or not renin is in the blood? To answer that, let's go back to the juxtaglomerular apparatus. There are specialized cells in the distal tubule that I am coloring in blue. Those specialized cells sense how much sodium and chloride is in the filtrate at this point. So they actually have channel proteins for sodium and chloride, and they sense how much sodium and chloride comes through. Imagine that the amount of sodium and chloride at this point is considered to be low. Remember, everything has been on autopilot up to this point. So if the amount of sodium and chloride in those blue cells is considered to be low or too low, then the implication is that that is a reflection of the blood plasma, which means that the sodium and chloride levels in the blood plasma are also too low. What is the solution if there isn't enough sodium and chloride in the blood? Then we need to add more sodium and chloride, and we do that by increasing the reabsorption of sodium chloride in the distal tubule. In other words, we need aldosterone. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus uses those blue cells to sense the sodium chloride. Those blue cells then talk to or communicate with the red cells that are surrounding the afferent arteriole. Those red cells are called granular cells, and granular cells secrete renin. So to summarize, the juxtaglomerular apparatus is instrumental in causing the secretion of aldosterone into the bloodstream, and thus triggering the reabsorption of sodium and chloride in the distal tubule. So the goal is to monitor the filtrate composition of sodium and chloride and communicate that information to the granular cells. When sodium chloride levels are low, renin is secreted into the bloodstream. Remember that renin is an enzyme, and so renin will take angiotensinogen and convert it into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I is acted on by ACE. In my drawing here, I have the ACE enzymes drawn in black. Notice that they're sticking out of the cells that line the blood vessel, the endothelial cells. In fact, those enzymes do line the endothelial cells, especially around the lungs. So ACE receptors/enzymes are prevalent in the bloodstream around the lungs. And they will grab angiotensin I as it goes past and convert it into angiotensin II. This concludes our brief lecture in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway.